Welcome to Shaping the NYC Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, David Shamshovich, and I'm here with my co-host,
Brenda Slukowski.
Hello to all our Skyliners, and welcome to another episode of Shaping the NYC Skyline. I'm your host, David Shamshovich, and I'm here with another one of our hosts, Camilla Almeida.
Hello, everybody.
And we're here today for, to me, it's one of the episodes that is near and dear to my heart. And maybe I say that a little too often, but I think it's true because today we spoke with Professor David Reiss, who is a professor at Brooklyn Law School and taught me real property when I was a law student at Brooklyn Law School.
You did a good job.
He did a great job. And he had just coming off from, he was telling me he was grading some of his real property exams, and I got a little bit of the school jitters, thinking back about, flashback about those hypotheticals.
I don't even like to think about it.
This year he had, and this episode's airing after everybody has given in their papers, apparently.
Which is good, because he gave the answer to his exam.
Well, he at least gave the question, because it was about good cause eviction, which is very, very timely. So law students should really be keeping up to date with all the news and the things that are happening, because it'll show up on your law school exam.
Yeah, you never know.
But who has time to read the news when you're studying case law, right?
Who has time to read the news?
Oh, yes, sure. We don't have time to read the news either. We're too busy reading The City of Yes and the new housing deal, 485X.
That's all we read.
Well, it's our lot in life. And David was phenomenal. There's so many things that he does. He obviously has been doing this for 20 years. He loves teaching. It's really interesting to see how he got into teaching. He went to NYU. He was an associate at two large law firms, and he ended up in academia. And so it's unusual, but it's less. It's the path that's less crossed, I think, than going, from law school to practicing.
And teaching is a gift.
One of his big specialties is financing, and he talks about subprime mortgages, which were, back in the day, what really contributed to the collapse given the mortgage-backed securities. He talks about the credit rating agencies and people losing trust in that, which is really what started that crisis in 2007, 2008. And there's a lot of repercussions that housing has on the larger economy. Yeah. Clearly, that's one of the things that we talk about on this podcast. But it's interesting to hear David's perspective, because he runs a clinic, so he works with lots of not-for-profits, and he educates students and tries to take these concepts and educate those who don't really get it or just starting out.
Yeah, simplify them and then educate people.
And that's what we're trying to do too. It's like, and when we're listening to, we're like in awe at all our guests, because we're learning something. Even if we've know a concept, to hear about a particular project where that was incorporated, or different aspects, like whether it be affordable housing, supportive housing, homeless shelters, and other types of assets class, commercial, community facility space, fresh bonuses. There's a number of them. We're learning constantly, and it's hard for me to call him David, because I know him as Professor Reiss, so it's very difficult. But David Reiss did a phenomenal job. He's such a well-spoken person, and he's such a great real property professor. I'm sure all our Skyliners are going to love it, but particularly probably his students, because he's a little bit of a celebrity, a real estate celebrity in Brooklyn Law.
You guys will enjoy it a lot.
Yep. So without further ado, I'm not going to talk anymore, because I want you to hear Professor David Reiss of Brooklyn Law School. Welcome to everybody to another edition of Shaping the NYC Skyline. I'm here with Camilla, and this is David Shamshovich.
Hello, everybody.
Unfortunately, Brenda couldn't be here. She was sick, and she's heartbroken that she can't be here for this very special episode, because we have a very special guest. Not that our other guests aren't special, but this guest happens to be very special to me. Why? Because this is the person who taught me real property at law school. He's a professor at Brooklyn Law School, where he concentrates on real estate finance and community development. And in fact, he's the founding director of the Community Development Clinic at Brooklyn Law School, which I participated in, whatever the correct wording of that is. And he teaches, obviously, real property classes, and we'll get into some of that. He was also recently the recipient of the Faculty Award for Excellence in Public Service, which makes perfect sense if you know who he is. And he also named to Law 360's 2024 editorial board. He serves as a research director of the Center for Urban Business Entrepreneurship. And you are still the chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board?
No, I stepped down in the beginning of 2023.
Okay, well, so we'll still discuss that. That wasn't such a long time ago. And he also does lots of scholarly work, given he's a professor. He's the author of a book on federal housing policy called Paying for the American Dream, How to Reform the Market for Mortgages. He also is a frequently quoted expert in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a frequent collaborator in The Hill and Curbed and other publications. I'd like to welcome everyone, Professor David Reiss.
Thank you. It's really fun to be here.
Yeah, we're very excited to have you. We have not had a person who's a researcher, a professor, an academic such as yourself, and particularly one who can speak to my acumen in real estate. Obviously, I didn't go right away into it. It took me some time. But as I thought back at the class that I took with you, which definitely resonated with me. I mean, I could literally picture it and picture you in that class.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just finished teaching property, not real property, just general property. And this is probably true for the two of you as well. It's so hard to remember what it was like when you knew nothing about real estate. And, the older you get, the more you're like, of deeds, contracts, mortgages, notes, it all makes sense. But, when you're 22, 23, 24, you're like, what is this stuff? And it's important to remember.
It's terrifying.
Yes, it's terrifying and befuddling. So, yeah.
It is. It's terrifying, and particularly in like a law school atmosphere where you're not really writing contracts. The tests are not about contracts. They're kind of geared towards more litigation. That's kind of the issue with law school, right?
Yeah.
I didn't even really know that transactional work was an option. You come in there thinking litigation, right? You see My Cousin Vinny, you see Law and Order, and that's what you think lawyers do.
And that's one of the fun things that I do is that I do focus on transactional law. So my real estate practice class that you took is really to expose students to a transactional practice and to make them think like deal lawyers and not to think like litigators.
Yeah.
It's really important to think like a litigator, but if you're going to be a deal lawyer, you got to need to know how deal lawyers think and how to minimize risk and protect your client as much as you possibly can.
I actually remember that you had actually had us draft certain provisions to account for particular situations. And I don't remember doing that in a lot of classes. That wasn't really the aim for lots of law school classes.
Yeah. No, that's true. So in my community development clinic, I have my students do a lot of contract drafting and business documents and things like that. And again, for the students who know that they want to do this or may think they may want to do this, it's one of the few places in the law school curriculum that you get that exposure.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing to do. And I'm just going to turn back a little bit and we'll get back to this place. But how did you get to where you are now? I know that's a long-winded question, but you can kind of summarize, lots of people go to law school and then they end up practicing, or maybe they end up in a different industry that's related, or general counsel. Lots of people obviously end up in academics, but how did that happen for you?
It's funny. Looking backwards, I think it all makes sense. But kind of going forward, it was just like, you're kind of finding your way. And I think when you talk to a lot of people, they describe their careers that way. But I graduated from college. I went to college in the late 80s. And the homeless crisis really began at that point in time. And as I was coming back from college breaks, I would just see it got literally worse and worse over the years. And I went to work at a housing agency that worked with people with histories of homelessness or histories of mental illness. And I really loved that work, but I also loved the kind of the real estate part of that work. And then after 4 years, I went to law school and I started having a focus on real estate because there was some connection between housing and real estate. And I thought I'd want to end up doing something like that. And then I worked at one law firm on environmental and land use issues, and then another law firm in their real estate group. And then I went to teach and have focused on real estate and community development since then.
So how did that transition happen did you start doing small gigs or like an adjunct professorship or teaching like that, and then transition? How did that transition occur?
It like a lot of great things about legal careers or maybe careers more generally, just serendipity. A friend was teaching at Seton Hall, one of my classmates from law school, and they needed someone to step into a position kind of on short order. And so it was an opportunity to try it out. I hadn't really been thinking about it. And so I would just say luck. It happened because of luck.
Well,
and a good friend.
I think what do you always say? It's a little bit of luck and a little bit of talent and some timing is required.
Yes. Okay. All three of those. And all three of those for sure.
So I think obviously serendipity. I think everybody at this table can talk to serendipity, myself included. I think it's interesting that that's the route you took. And what is it that you taught at Seton Hall when you first started?
So, they needed someone to cover a civil litigation clinic. And, given my interests, it was, again, lucky that some of the issues we were working on were predatory lending. And so it was kind of deed theft scams. And I had to really do a lot of deep dives as a litigator, but deep dives into real estate and real estate finance issues, and really exposed me to kind of like the sordid underbelly of note sellers, who all kind of operate at the margins, and the people who fund them. And then I got exposure to kind of the broader housing finance market and the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the rating agencies. And I just got really interested. I had never really understood the complexity of our housing finance system.
Yeah, and particularly a lot of the things that you do are from the perspective of the unsophisticated individual, and we'll get into that, because a lot of the things we've been talking so far in this podcast really is kind of the commercial part of residential, and not the residential part of the residential, which I think is an aspect that you particularly know a lot about.
Yeah.
So how many years did you work at Seton Hall for?
Just for about a year, maybe a little bit more. It was covering someone who was on leave. And then I was, again, just really lucky that Brooklyn Law School, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, was looking for someone. And if they had written a job description for David Reiss, it would have been this job description, which was to do community development, to do property and real property classes. And luckily, they offered me the position, and I've been there for 21 years.
Oh, wow.
So you've been there for a long time, so you've seen a lot of things happen. How has it changed over time, whether it be in Brooklyn Law School in general or the academic field in general?
Those are good questions. I would say that when you're a student or an outsider to academia, you just think it's like this big monolith. But when you're inside it, when you're employed by it and thinking about it, you realize that really big trends have a really big impact on education. So, two big trends, demographics. So when there are lots of 22-year-olds, there's a really big demand for law school. And when there's fewer 22-year-olds, there's less of a demand for law school. So you don't think of it as a business, but there's that part of it. And I think we're all looking at what people are calling like this demographic cliff that's coming up, because the number of 22-year-olds is diminishing. So that's not nothing. And then the other really interesting thing in my 20 years was, after the financial crisis, lots of people went to law school because they wanted to exit the not very good job market. And then, there needs to be jobs for people, as they graduate from law school. And so to really understand that interplay between why people want to be in law school, and then, make sure that there's opportunities for them after law school. You don't really think about that until you're kind of on the inside.
Yeah, I think it's, having gone through that a little bit, I can understand that perspective of those trends and all those things happen. But how is finding a job in real estate afterward? I know that Deborah Bechtel, who's recently retired, has been a big proponent of Brooklyn Law School students, has referred many great associates to Sign and Shine, and Brooklyn Law School has been in general. Obviously, I got my first job from Brooklyn Law School. How do you foster that kind of environment or assist students in getting a job afterwards?
So some professors take an immense amount of pride and joy out of helping students. And Debbie Bechtel is probably like at the top of the pyramid as far as I'm concerned. And she's retiring after being there for 27 years. And she and I work really closely with like the two real estate nerds on the faculty. And we just are arranging for kind of one of our star students to be involved in a prop tech event that's happening soon. And she has her ear to the ground as to which firms are hiring and which students are looking. And she and I are constantly consulting, like, oh, is this person a good match? Is that person a good match? But 85% of the credit goes to Debbie, and then I'll take 15%, where we're just trying to kind of think, oh, these people are interested in real estate. They're interested in boutique firm. They're interested in something maybe that wouldn't happen through the kind of the big normal channels of the career center. And certainly alums and certainly students understand how valuable somebody like Debbie is in their careers, but it's not always generally recognized. And so it was really nice. We had a big retirement party for her, and just like the theme of this party was mentorship matters, community matters, and she was really the person who made this wonderful real estate community at Brooklyn Law School.
And I mean, I didn't know her when I was at Brooklyn Law School, but I've heard so many things about her because of that relationship. And so I agree that's a wonderful thing. And she's very well known for that. When you first started at Brooklyn Law School, were you hired to do real estate specifically, or were you hired to do other things? And if so, what was were you handed a curriculum, or did you have some maneuverability?
So I was hired. I taught in my first couple of years. I taught property. I taught real estate practice, and I taught the community development clinic. Probably my main focus was supposed to be the clinic. Debbie had a transactional clinic, but as you were saying about law schools, law schools are not really focused on transactional learning that much, and certainly not 20 years ago. And so Debbie, before me, and then Jonathan Askin, who came in a little bit after me, really created this phenomenal transactional clinical program, and we had to build it from the ground up, each in our individual areas. And so that's also really fun to be you get to do your own thing.
Well, so the community development clinic, for those who don't know, I would love for you to explain what it is, because it's obviously lots of law schools have different types of clinics, but this is geared towards a particular type of client. You have students interacting with them. It's all pro bono. Maybe you want to just explain what it is, what the goals of the clinic are, what it's accomplished in its years.
I think some people will kind of get the idea of a litigation clinic right away, like I'm representing a tenant in housing court. A transactional clinic is different. I mean, transactional lawyers, it's not going to be a shocker what I'm about to say, but for people who aren't transactional lawyers, a transactional clinic like mine, we represent mostly not-for-profits on pretty much anything except we don't litigate for them, mostly because I'm afraid to go into New York State Supreme Court. So, but we'll do anything else. So we'll do land use. I'll have them appear before community boards. We will do tax work and appearing before the IRS. Work with all sorts of regulators like the New York AG and the Department of State. So kind of like a general counsel, and then also do transactional work, leases, contracts, debt workouts. And so students, they're usually on the young side, they're usually, 23, 24. Most of them have never met a client. They've done work in externships for clients, but they've never been the lawyer. And so the coolest part of the job is prepping them for their first time meeting a client, and for them to really understand that the buck stops with them. And from the client's perspective, they are the lawyer. And one of the big humps they need to get over, as pretty much every law student does, is that however they see themselves, and they know all their flaws and all the stuff they don't know, their client sees them as the expert. And they need to navigate that and absorb it and accept the criticisms they get from their clients, and accept, the trust that their clients put in them.
Yeah, I remember it being a very difficult time because it's something that you're just not used to. And I remember that you giving me a similar speech, or giving our class a similar speech. But it's tough when you're a law student, and even when you're a first 1L, even if you've passed the bar, you still don't necessarily feel like, some people at 5L don't even realize that. How did that start? How do you get your clients? You get referrals? How does that exactly work?
So one of the benefits of offering free legal services is that getting clients is very easy. So like maybe in my first semester it took a little time, calling around to kind of the usual suspects, legal services and the Lawyers Alliance of New York, organizations that work with lots of not-for-profits, and that would be useful, from other colleagues doing similar work. But really, after a couple of semesters, clients flow in, and one cool thing is just often I just got an email today. A former client will refer a new client, and one thing that I find really rewarding, or that I really like a lot, is certain geographic areas, I'm a go-to person for people in that area. So there's a bunch of clients in Fort Greene and Clinton Hill around Walt Whitman houses, and they know that our clinic is available to people in the community to assist when they want to start a kind of not-for-profit venture. And it's kind of fun to be, a communities lawyer as well as to just be a good lawyer too.
It is an interesting career to follow. I used to work on an immigration firm that we did exactly the same thing, working for nonprofits, and it is a different kind of feeling that you have working for them.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, yeah, and I think for students, I'm always pushing my students. A lot of them are going to end up like David at really awesome law firms, but like that they should think at some point in their career they're going to do some pro bono work at some point in their career. I tell all of my students at some point in your career you're going to be sitting on the board of a not-for-profit, and you're going to learn about board governance as part of this clinic. And I want you to file this away in the back of your head, so like when you've been practicing for 10 or 12 years or something like that, you will say, oh, I can do this. This is something I can help with.
Yeah, I mean, I think doing pro bono work obviously is something that's 50 hours is what's suggested by the bar, by the New York bar. Recently, it's not a requirement, but a lot of people do at least 50, and it's a very important thing for people to do, and that's one of the things that I took away from that clinic. I'm just, how did that clinic not exist before you came along? Why was that idea something that happened 20 years ago and not before, if you know?
This is maybe like armchair history, but before I do that, I just want to say something about what you said about the bar suggested 50 hours. One thing, like the older that I get, you realize there's all these amazing professions out there, but law is pretty unique in kind of pushing its the members of the bar to do some service beyond their own practice, and that's a really cool thing about the bar, and that is really part of the ethos of being a lawyer, and I appreciate that more and more over time, because I don't think accountants have have some engineers don't have
back to the community moment.
Yeah, and that is, it's a reminder to us about our connections to the community, and I think that's really cool and really awesome. And for some people, it brings incredible satisfaction to them, as well as providing amazing service to people who would not otherwise be able to afford their services. As to your question, this is my armchair history. The first generation of clinicians were almost completely litigators at like legal services and defenders organizations, and that was kind of that notion of representing low-income people in court, whether it was criminal or civil. That was just where the people came from. Yeah. And it took a generation for the clinical movement to say, hey, there's another 50% of our law students who are not going to be doing, litigation. And so we need to think of great experiences for them in law school, because people should learn how to be lawyers when they're in law school in addition to learning the law, right? Like that seems maybe obvious to every practicing lawyer, but like it took a little while for law schools to realize like learning how to be a lawyer is key. And you could do a lot of intense learning in law school that sets you up really well for your first few years of practice.
Yeah, I mean, law school is a very interesting animal. You have to kind of attend it or read a lot about it in order to understand how it functions, but it's really an intellectual pursuit. It doesn't really teach you always all the nitty-gritty things that you need to do. One of the things that I found frustrating when we did the community development clinic, and you could tell me if this is either change or how you face this, probably not change, because we had a semester to do it. Right? Is it a semester or a year? I can't recall. Is it?
When you were there, I think it was a semester. I started out doing a year, and then it became a semester.
So the difficulty is what you might presume my question is, which is sometimes you can't finish the representation in that time. So how do you transfer that file so that it continues in good hands? I mean, obviously you're managing the whole situation, so that doesn't change. But it's got to be a little frustrating for some of the students. Maybe not. Who knows?
Yeah, no, that's a totally fair question. I think there's kind of two mentalities amongst people who teach clinics. One is, let's give students really big, important matters, and they'll do a little part, but they'll do it superbly. They'll draft a brief, or they'll draft a contract, but they'll just be one part of a very big deal or big litigation. I tend to be in the opposite model, which is like give students relatively small things that hopefully some of them they will complete. And so I always try to have a range of clients for for each team, and I call some like baby clients, which are like they just want to start up an organization. And so you're going to be stuff that for a practicing lawyer is no big deal at all, like incorporating them, but then also drafting bylaws, which has some sophistication to it if you want to do it right, some other kind of setup things. But the really important thing there is the counseling that they give the client, and they learn so much by prepping for that counseling. And then I have some other matters that are bigger, and so it's always a balance between those little baby matters and then bigger matters, and hope that they have both experiences. And then I also tell them, this is exactly what it's like to go work, for a legal employer, which is you get handed a bunch of files when you start, and you hand over a bunch of files when you're done, right? So it's not that different, but it can be frustrating. And then the other thing that I do to kind of address David's concern is I have like a simulation, like a 6-part simulation, so that every student gets an experience of interviewing and counseling and negotiating.
That's right, I forgot
that's
about that.
And students usually love that simulation, and what it gives me is that consistency across all my students, that they at least have that exposure.
Yeah, it's like that. It's kind of like a role play thing where you're.
Oh, that's so cool.
So this way you get to act out those things, even if you don't, because in the transaction you don't know how it's going to go. It can go poorly, and then you get the carpet pulled out from under you. It can go really well, very fast. You just don't know.
Yeah.
More often than not, your blockades are coming at you, and then you're trying to deal with them, and it could take more time than you expected.
Yeah.
So the community development clinic, I think, is a phenomenal thing. And if anybody out there is listening and they're not for profit and they think that they fall within this, I definitely think you should contact Professor David Reiss at Brooklyn Law School. You can look him up, and we'll put in your information in the notes as well, so they can contact you if anything. So in academia, I know there's a lot of pressure, or at least this is the what I've heard, which is there's a lot of pressure to publish books, and particularly articles. And specifically, if you're a law school professor, there's lots of academic publications that I guess you're pressured to do. This is my opinion. You can confirm or deny it. How did you lean into what your focus would be in there? I know real estate there's lots of things you can talk about real estate, but how did you lean into that focus, and what was that focus, which I know has changed somewhat over time, not necessarily maybe because of your interest, but because times have changed, things have evolved in real estate?
Usually I choose to write about something that I don't fully understand. So I really want to understand it. So I had spent a bunch of years writing about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and their role in the housing finance system, because they were so big and so important, and it was impossible to get your hands around them. So it's the story of the blind men and the elephant, where you put your hands here and you feel the ear and you think it's like a piece of paper, and you put another arm around the trunk and you feel like it's like a snake or whatever. And the housing finance system is so massive, it's so complicated, it changes so quickly that it's really hard to get your arms around it. And I'm sure you guys see this in your practice as well. And so I just kind of wanted to get my arms around that. And so I wrote a series of articles, generally with a public policy focus of this is what they do, this is what they're supposed to be doing, and where's the gap between those two things, and try to explain that to an audience.
Yeah. And so mortgages is really a lot of where your focus was, and maybe still is. You wrote a book about it. Can you tell us more about maybe the book that you wrote? What was the inspiration for that book?
Sure. So the book, which is not yet published but is complete, is kind of a history of how did people pay for their homes from the early 1800s of the United States till now. And it starts out with a story of a little Provident Savings and Loans Association or something like that. And it was outside of Philadelphia, and it was a bunch of people, including a lamplighter, who got together, and they would each kick in a little bit of money each month. And then when they had enough money for somebody to buy a house, that person would get the money, and people would keep kicking in money, kind of like an early version of the Bailey Brothers and Loans and It's a Wonderful Life. And then we went from there and, got very sophisticated over time, but to really the early 21st century, where you have this global flow of capital from maybe a person in a village in China that is, helping to pay for a house in Iowa, because the global capital markets are so good at moving capital to where it's going to be getting the highest return, and it's just incredibly complex. And so I wanted to chart that history and then give some policy suggestions as to how to make it better.
And so I know there's a lot of factors. I don't want you to get into all of them that led us from this really simple process to what can become very complicated, depending on the size of what you're purchasing and the loan and the terms, and there's going to be so many complications. But did you see any kind of flow as to why there was a complication, aside from technology, increase in population? Are there any other things that you can note?
I mean, I guess let me say 4 eras of this, and that's maybe a simplification, but let's say that early era is mutual help, where a community comes together to achieve something to benefit all of them. So not in the public interest per se, but in our mutual interests, so like mutual savings and loans associations, things like that. And then I would say in the late 19th century, there were people who had a lot of capital, and sometimes it was a family or some East Coast banker, and they would want to make money, and they would go send their agents out west and look for people who had land and wanted to work the land but didn't have capital, and they would kind of make deals to lend them money to buy more land. You may have read in college, perhaps, O Pioneer by Willa Cather, and it's effectively about people, I think, in Nebraska who struggle, borrow money, and then end up, owning a good amount of land. And so you have this sophistication that develops in the late 1800s, and it's the early stages of like mortgage banking. And then you have the Great Depression, and the Great Depression kind of destroys a lot of the infrastructure of the private lending apparatus. And then you have the federal government coming in a big way. And so that's the early stages of Fannie Mae. That's the early stages of the Federal Housing Administration, the early stages of a lot of things that we don't have anymore, but that kind of saved the banking industry, saved the housing industry, saved the construction industry, and created our modern infrastructure and a national mortgage market and a regulated mortgage market and a market that had a lot of consumer protections built into it. So it kind of replaced this private lender, kind of like Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, who kind of was exploiting everybody, with one where the federal government was saying, if you're operating in this market, there's some constraints, there's some guardrails. And then the last stage would be, our global markets with mortgage-backed securities and subprime lending and predatory lending, and now with a qualified mortgage and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, kind of that's where we're at now.
Yeah, because things have gotten so sophisticated now that it's easy to defraud people.
Yes. And you can defraud from a great distance. You're not necessarily defrauding the person, down the street. Yeah, you're defrauding someone very far away. And the defrauding can happen in both directions. You could be defrauding a homeowner with a terrible loan, and you could be defrauding an investor in Iceland with a terrible residential mortgage-backed security.
And there's so much to unpack there, too. But since we're on that topic of fraud, and this is something that we quickly discussed right before we got on the mic, which is you had recently been on Brazilian television.
Yep.
And I also read an article about Mickey Barreto, who had claimed to own the New Yorker hotel. And it's an interesting story, and it kind of fits in with this fraud. Like, how did this person how did they do what they did, and they used some kind of loophole in connection with rent stabilization to do that?
I think lawyers and I guess just real people in the real estate business will kind of chuckle at this story, and then there's kind of like a sordid interpretation of this story as well that probably happens more in Brooklyn and Queens than with the New Yorker hotel in the middle of Manhattan. So effectively, and again, this is kind of inside baseball, but effectively, our system for sharing information about who owns property is a very sophisticated but kind of open system where you can record deeds in the county land records of wherever the property is located and record mortgages and easements and all sorts of documents. And so the ease of accessing those records and putting things on the public record is very easy. And it's a great system because we have lots of transactions happening all the time, but it's also something that can be abused. And so here we have a situation where someone effectively claimed and filed a deed saying that they owned the New Yorker hotel right in the middle of Midtown. And this caused the owner of the hotel endless pain. And I think there were some things that should have been focused on earlier by the owner of the hotel. So maybe they let this get more out of control than it needed to be. But it effectively, changed the ownership so that their property taxes went up dramatically. It had, really, really big negative effects. And I think a lot of times people get so surprised by this and like, how do we let this happen? But if you have a system that's supposed to be easy to use, then it's also often easy to screw up or defraud people with. Like it was, 20 years ago or so, the Daily News had a headline how they stole the Empire State Building because they did the same thing. They filed a deed in the name of the Daily News and said, "Look, we stole the Empire State Building. How could this happen?" It makes for a great headline, but overall the system works pretty well the way it is. But you were mentioning about fraud. there's this thing of deed theft, and that often happens with very elderly people, maybe living by themselves, where someone will change the name on the deed and take out a mortgage on the property. And usually there's a lot of people who are working together, maybe somebody at a title company and somebody at a lender and somebody in the community. And it can be devastating, and it can result in someone losing their home and just having a miserable 10 or 15 years as they're resolving this. And so that's the really bad form of deed theft. Mickey Brado's is more like the kind of crazy story version of deed theft. But if you were the owner of the New Yorker, you would have been very miserable about what he did, but like it makes for a good story.
And it was funny what he did, which is he booked the night at $149, and then he asks for a lease, because if he gets a lease and he's there for at least 6 months, that he automatically essentially has some rights towards that unit.
It's some version of that. It's even more obscure. So, and for listeners, in New York City, we have this very complex system of rent regulation. And this system of rent regulation has special rules that apply to what we call in New York SROs, single room occupancies, which are very small units, kind of like a hotel, kind of like an apartment, depending on which one it is. And there were some special rules that for certain of those hotels, you could request a lease after staying there for one night. And I don't think we should go in the weeds any more than that. But with that basis, he was able to make this claim that he had a tenancy. My understanding is that when he asserted this, the owner didn't kind of counter it, and so he then took the position that he had this, and then parlayed that into a claim that he owned the entire hotel.
Yeah.
And it kind of spun out of control from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's more anecdotal than anything. And as you said, this is not something that happens regularly. It happens, but the risks versus the actual system, you're not getting as much fraud as you necessarily think could happen. But at the same time, it does happen. And speaking of pro bono, in my prior firm, I did a deed theft or deed fraud pro bono action, many more than 50, probably 3 or 4 times more over several years. We ended up prevailing, but not after a long time, and it was actually connected to the subprime market. So this woman was dying to refinance, and somebody came to her. It was, like you said, a title person, an attorney. It was like a group of people working together. She basically deeded the property to them. They deeded somebody, in a scheme to say, you deed the property to us, and we'll take care of the refi, and then we'll deed it back to you because our credit's better, something to that effect. And subprime mortgages is another area that you had focused on, particularly when that was a very prominent issue, or at least one that was an issue. Maybe we didn't know about it. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then talk a little bit about the state of the subprime mortgage? Because you don't really hear a lot about it, but I assume it still happens. But maybe the regulations changed after that it doesn't happen as often, but maybe you can just discuss that a little bit.
Sure. So as we get older, we're like, well, everyone knows what subprime is, but if you're 25, maybe you don't know what a subprime is. But as all this money was flowing into that fourth stage of the housing finance market that I talked about, where we have mortgage-backed securities and we have Wall Street, who's generating a lot of fees by making capital available to expand the number of people who can have access to mortgages. There weren't that many kind of consumer protection guardrails in place, and fees were being generated every time a mortgage was being made, and fees were being generated by companies like Countrywide, which doesn't exist anymore, or these subprime lenders, and then they were passing these over to Wall Street firms that were packaging them and selling them to investors in Iceland and all across the world. But there was just this drive. Fees were being generated and people were making money. And so they pushed the quality of the loans, and they incentivized people to kind of not pay attention to fundamentals like, can somebody repay this loan? And at first people weren't really concerned about that, because they're like, well, we'll just foreclose on them, so we'll be okay. They may be out of a home, but we'll be okay. But then by the early 2000s, there wasn't even really this notion that that these will be paid back, and so it was a wild west of lending, and there were a lot of victims. With Dodd-Frank, they put in a lot of guardrails to keep that from happening again. And so really, those subprime mortgages there are so fewer of them, and we really have much more of a plain vanilla market. And we can criticize to some extent the plain vanilla market. Maybe it's not as broad of a market as it should be, but it has kind of killed that very extreme predatory behavior that was kind of rampant, in the non-prime, subprime part of the mortgage market.
Yeah. And it was also a lot of time geared towards people who are not sophisticated, the elderly, minorities, people in poor areas, right? It was probably more happening more in those areas to those people than others.
Yes, that's 100% true. And there's a really weird thing that someone said, Wall Street or financial firms, they'll invent a product that works really well for somebody like a young doctor or a young lawyer. It's like, we'll have a 5-year interest-only mortgage because, you're at the beginning of your legal career, but in 5 years, no problem. And then they'll sell that mortgage to an elderly person who's on Social Security. Like in 5 years, their income is not going to be any different than their income is now. It's set for the rest of their life. Obviously, that product doesn't work for them. And so, you take a good thing and then you put it in the wrong place and it becomes a horrible, horrible thing.
So when you sell these things, you have to have them rated. And you mentioned the ratings agencies like S&P and Moody's, right? If I'm remembering them correctly.
That's right. And Fitch.
So those are the three that I know of, at least the three.
There's some smaller ones, Kroll.
So those rating agencies, obviously, their job is to take a look at what's backing up those, the mortgages that are backing up those mortgage-backed securities, and rate them and say what's the odds of it getting paid back and things like that, so that people can judge. Why was that? Where did that fail? How did that not happen?
It's so interesting. This, I think we're still kind of
unpacking
that, but I find when you look at kind of some of the there's a bunch of academics. There's Professor Patricia McCoy at Boston College and some others who have spent so much time looking into this and very valuable research. But I think when you read a lot of the things written by the big players like Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson and Tim Geithner, I think, and there was the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, I think we have a lot of good sense. But one of the interesting things that people don't really realize is the problem wasn't so much that these subprime mortgages were going to tank everybody, but it's that people didn't know how big the problem was. And so it was really an informational problem. And that's often what happens in a panic. It's not necessarily that all of these assets have no value. It's that people don't know how to value them, and then that gums up the works of everything. It gums up, when you're doing repos, and when banks are trying to, get short-term credit, and they're putting up assets, and people are like, I don't know how much this subprime mortgage-backed security is worth. And so the panic was really over bad information, and actually the subprime market in total was like a tiny, tiny percentage of the global capital markets, like tiny, but it made people worry. We thought the rating agencies understood what everything is worth, and now we realize that the rating agencies don't really understand what everything's worth. And so it was really kind of, credit derives from the Latin term credo, which is, to have belief, I believe, and that, that people didn't know whether they could believe what they were being told, what AAA meant or what triple B meant or all those things. And so you had this crisis of faith in the credit markets, and that's what drove the financial crisis.
Wow, so that's interesting because maybe I just misunderstood it. I always thought that it was just the mortgage-backed securities that then really were resold, repackaged, and then they were worthless. But what you're saying is really actually just like enlightening to me. It's the people lost faith in the credit agencies, which are kind of the backbone of what things are worth.
Well, when you think about the basics of like a panic, and we talk about bank panics, but let's just talk about financial panics. Really, the panic is when counterparties can't trust each other. So like if I need to have a certain amount of reserves and I put up certain assets to support those reserves, and those assets are, mortgage-backed securities or something like that, my counterparty, so if it's two financial firms, my counterparty needs to know how much that asset is. I'm not going to lend you $100 million unless I know that you're giving me $110 million of assets as collateral. And so if that collateral is, maybe worth $50 million, or actually it is worth $99 million, but I don't know it, like I'm not going to trust it, and I'm not going to do business with you. And then you can't keep your reserves at their right level, and I'm probably a counterparty with somebody else on the other side of that equation. And so all of a sudden you freeze up the financial markets, and that's why we need things like the Federal Reserve to kind of step in when there is a panic.
Yeah. You need a referee, somebody to mediate the thing.
And also somebody with a really deep pocket who's going to say, like, until we figure this out, we're going to pump a lot of liquidity into the system, and we'll be the lender of last resort.
It's like your parents.
Yeah. Well, if you're
Not
lucky.
your parents.
Yeah, if you're lucky.
I'm saying your parents in general.
Maybe my kids think that's what I'm like, but I don't know.
So you have this crisis, which is multifaceted. People at the time, obviously, nobody knows what's happening. It's just people are still unpacking it, like you said. How do we've obviously moved past that. Maybe we're still reflecting on it. We've learned lessons. How do you think we move past that? Obviously, real estate is cycles, but how did that cycle pass that people are more interested in real estate, had more faith in real estate and the housing market in general?
I'll talk about residential in particular, but I think there was a lot of reforms put into segments of the industry. Appraisers, rating agencies, Wall Street firms, and so I think a lot of the industries. Industry doesn't like regulation, but after something like a panic, it's kind of hard to say like, oh well, it would have been fine if we left everyone to do their own thing. And then another thing that I think only a handful of people were really pushing before the financial crisis was consumer protection is part of ensuring that a financial system works properly. Because if you allow people to fleece all the regular people across the country, that is going to create a cycle of bad things.
Yeah.
And so, Alan Greenspan, when he was the chair of the Federal Reserve, he kind of said that idea is nonsense. And there was a handful of academics and advocates who said, hey, if you could treat all the homeowners this way, it's not only bad for them, but it's systemically bad. And I think that argument won the day and was reflected in Dodd-Frank and the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And, it's not like everything is perfect. Definitely things can be fixed. But, that kind of Wild West has been kind of brought under the sheriff came to town.
Yeah, and you don't really hear a lot about, like I said, the subprime mortgage market and things like that going awry. But at the same time, then you're going from crisis to crisis. So you have 2007, 2008, and then the good times are rolling really, really nicely until you hit to COVID, right?
Yeah.
So COVID creates a bigger problem with evictions. People can't go to work. They can't make money. They're not paying their rent. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens there. And now we're in a different kind of period, which I'm actually having a hard time grasping and understanding, because similar to when you're in 2007, 2008, when you're in it, you don't really see it. Maybe we'll see it 5 years from now. But what do you call what's happening now? Like the time period now. What's the market like now? It's not good, but it's not bad. It's people have money, but they don't. It's a very strange. The credit markets are kind of working, but the interest rates are high. Inflation, construction costs, affordable housing, housing in general not being built. All these things that are converging. Do you have a sense as to, or a theory, or if you thought about what's transpiring currently, whether it be in the credit markets or in the housing market in general? If not, then this question could just go to the garbage.
I'm gonna pull one theme from your question, and it's an interesting thing, and I'm sure for the two of you this is true as well. But like, you could read about something and you're like, oh, that's interesting, but then you live through something, you're like, oh, now I get it. And so like when you live in, I guess for me, I was, cognizant of the world, I guess, in the early 80s. I was like I was like a young teenager or something. And even then I knew like my parents like were paying, 20% on their credit card debt or something, or that was the interest rate back then. And then, when my wife and I were buying our house, get 3%, 3.5% interest rate. And now with interest rates going up, you really understand, that interest rates are such a driver of household well-being and then firm well-being. And there's a piece of that is luck. We were talking about serendipity early on. Like, was I looking to buy a house when interest rates were at 3 or 4, or am I looking for, did I get married and have kids when interest rates were at 7 or 8? And that's a big driver.
Or at 17 and 18.
Yeah, or 17 and 18, like in the early 80s.
Exactly.
And like, did you get a 10-year ARM? Like maybe I did, and like it's resetting in 2025, and then you have to think, well, that's going to really, double the interest payment. But it was really nice when you got that 10-year ARM at 3%. But you really understand, like, these decisions matter, and very few people can really kind of evaluate what the range of things is going to happen. And so I think we see this on the commercial side as well, where you get a 5-year mortgage, and you have to either refinance or extend and pretend or whatever you do, or you have to do some kind of workout. But the planning, the being risk averse as to all of the factors you can control is a really important thing to survive for the long time in business, and also to make sure that your household, your home, and your savings account for your kids' college or whatever is doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, no, I think interest rates are a huge driver. We've heard this time and time again because it increased costs. Whatever extra money you have to pay for interest, obviously you don't have to buy a home. You don't have for improvements or other things. How is it that you came to focus on the financial aspect? Because to me, the financial aspect is the most complicated part of it. I work on lots of construction loans, refis on the commercial side. Even on the residential side could get complicated. Obviously, you don't have much negotiation. You really just have to sign it. I guess it's nice to have it for information, but I've never negotiated a residential mortgage like I do a commercial one. But it's definitely the more complicated one. I don't think you had a financial background. Maybe I was wrong, but I don't
No,
think
you're right. I did not.
And for me, at least, it was hard because I also didn't have a financial background to learn the concepts. And there's still obviously new concepts coming out all the time that you have to relearn. But how did you get interested in this particular, what I would consider the more sophisticated, difficult area of real estate?
I think it goes back to what I said earlier, which is like, I want to understand this. I want to understand it. When I was writing this book about housing finance, I said I want to write a book that my mom could understand. My mom, who's 89, was a first grade teacher and has zero interest in anything to do with finance. And so the reason I'm going to stop saying this is because there's no way she'll understand this book except in the broadest way, and she'd be so bored by 99% of what's contained in the book. But there is a real value of explaining complex things to a broader audience. That's a value in itself. And the other thing is, until you can explain your whatever you're studying to a broad audience, you probably don't really understand it that well. So the act of explaining it, and that's one of the cool things about being a teacher. You teach, if you started teaching a real estate practice class, you'd realize there's all these things you took for granted that you didn't really know why. Like, and you'd be like, really? What, that? And you'd have to kind of figure it out. And that's a cool thing about teaching, is that when you can teach it clearly, then you understand it. My first couple of years of teaching real estate practice was like, I know this, but I have to be able to, it has to get out of my mouth. And then you get better at it over time. But yeah.
Well, luckily you're before a bunch of students who probably don't know the difference.
They do know. Students totally know when you know what you're talking. Not that they think you don't know what you're talking about, but they know when you are explaining it clearly, because otherwise they want to pull out their hair.
No, it's definitely right, because I remember taking intense notes in lots of classes and writing down pretty much everything the professor said. Like, if it said a deed is this, and then I would write down the definition. If they stuttered or if they veered off that path, it would be difficult for me to finish my notes and then to understand exactly how they wanted me to spit it back at them. Yeah. Although law school, as you know, is not like that. You don't define deeds. It's really like a hypothetical. And then you try to resolve that hypothetical for what it is.
But you need to know what a deed is to do that well. It's funny. I'm in the middle of grading exams. I don't know if my students will listen to this or if they'll listen to this before or after the exams are out. But one piece of advice I gave them is that the most important word on a law school exam is the word because. Like, don't just tell me, the facts. Don't just tell me the law. Tell me, this is what should happen in this case because this is what the law says. And you have to connect the facts to the law, and you need to understand the facts in the law. And that's pretty fundamental to being a lawyer and being good at one or being good at the other is insufficient. You have to be good at both and apply them together.
If I have to convince somebody of something, like somebody disputed something with me in a contract, and I wrote to them, "You're wrong because..." Like, we're going to say, "You're wrong."
You're wrong.
That's not very convincing, guys. Like, you're wrong because this is what
unless you do all caps, then it'll be convincing. So
I mean, listen, there's some people who rely on that, but I think the because is important, and hopefully your because is a decent reason. And for all you law students out there, it doesn't matter what your answer is as long as it has some sort of reasoning and is rational.
Makes sense.
That is 100% true. Certainly on a law school exam. For a client, that might be less true, but for a law school exam, it doesn't. Yeah. It does. There's a pretty wide latitude there. So
exactly, for client is a totally different story, and do not follow that.
But you level up. You have the first stage at law school, then you improve a little bit for the bar exam, and then you need to figure it out the because for the
Exactly.
client.
Hopefully
Yeah,
by
yeah,
the bar exam,
yeah.
you're figuring out the because too, because then you're gonna
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
not gonna pass that exactly either.
Yeah.
What's the focus of Brooklyn now in terms of real estate? How is the focus, whether it be in your courses or in the other courses that they're teaching? Because, like I said, real estate is cyclical, up and down. I'm not saying anything new, but are they handling that in a way where they're updating the things fairly quickly? Because lots of things are happening very quickly.
You mean in terms of like the curriculum you're talking
Yeah.
about? Yeah. So again, I'm going to give a lot of credit to Debbie Bechtel, but she and I have really focused. I'm giving her the first and foremost credit, really focused on bringing in a ton of adjuncts who are right in the middle of practice. They're general counsel of developers, they're partners at law firms, they are high-level people in government and, in transactional capacity. And so we have this cadre, mostly alums, but a cadre of adjuncts who really bring that real world experience that our students really like and make them what we call them Brooklyn ready, like they're going to graduate kind of knowing the practice of real estate law. And we take a lot of pride in that. And I would say that we have probably, one of the most comprehensive, rich real estate curricula of any law school, certainly, I think, in the New York area, but way beyond that as well.
Yeah, I think Brooklyn Law School gets not as much credit. It gets credit, but it doesn't get as much credit as it deserves. It's actually a very wonderful place, an amazing community, and amazing professors such as yourself. Who I actually adored. So many people out there, and it's such a great community to be a part of. If I may ask you one final question is, what's next for you? You're working on this book, and it comes out when?
I'm hoping 2025, because books take a long time to actually go from draft to publication.
Actually, how did that book come about? Because I think that's an interesting issue.
So, it was really because I had been writing about these different segments of the housing finance system, and I was like, where did this all come from? And so I wanted to bring it back, like, how did it start? And then, how did we get to where we are? And what were the linkages? Like, kind of what's the genealogy of it? And just my own curiosity, really, more than anything else.
It makes sense, right?
It
Because
does.
this is your focus. So clearly you'd want to know the origins, right? If you find out you're adopted, you'd be like,
Yeah.
I'm adopted. I got to find my parent. It's like, I love mortgage finance. I need to find out how this all started.
Yeah. And then, you go back, you can go back, the American system, comes from England, but it also comes from Rome and cultures for thousands of years have thought of ways of getting some liquidity out of an illiquid asset like real estate. And so it's, pretty fundamental. I don't want to say to the human experience necessarily, but pretty fundamental to the commercial human experience is this desire to kind of own, improve, and then use for other purposes real estate. And we've seen this in so many cultures.
Are you doing a lot of microfiche in the basement of Brooklyn Law?
Microfiche gives me the worst headache in the universe. So I've avoided microfiche, but I have been looking at so many old annual reports of the FHA or of Fannie Mae. I think I read every annual report of the FHA ever. But there's always little tidbits that you didn't know, and you might have been, one of 5 people who have done this. So you're hopefully going to kind of improve the body of knowledge about this. And you get this, well, maybe you won't get this, but you get this appreciation of all those scholars who, wrote about, the housing market in the 1930s, and then it went into the Library of Congress and sat there, and nobody, ordered it for 30 years. But then you get it, and you're like, oh, that's why it's that way. And you understand that, academics and scholars, they don't often have necessarily the biggest impact in the present, but the body of knowledge that they helped create helps us understand our world.
How did you pitch that book, or did someone approach you about writing a book?
I pitched the book. I sent it to a bunch of presses, and then one press was interested. So that was exciting for me.
And then what's the timeline? You write a draft, and then
You write a couple of chapters and an outline, and then when you're done with it, then you deliver to them, and then they take a good amount of time to go from you delivering the final manuscript. They send it out to be reviewed by other people, so it's a pretty lengthy process. And I started doing this before COVID. COVID came, so it's been taking me a while. I was talking about looking at all those FHA annual reports, I guess it's like when maybe you write a brief and all the cases you looked at that you rejected but you put the key cases into the brief. The editing process of what's important versus what's not important is massive, and every lawyer, every academic knows that sensation of you have this iceberg where the work product is like a little bit above the surface, and then there's everything below the surface that is everything that went into making it happen.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine, like, I look at a 20 or 30 page contract and I'm making sure everything is like, I imagine a few hundred pages. That's got to be like, I cannot believe it.
Yes.
And this is your first book that you've written,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So what is it that took you were doing lots and lots of articles. Why is it that you hadn't dived into a book before this?
So part of that is just professional stuff that when you're going up for tenure, they would like you to have articles. That's kind of like the standard form in a law school. And then I also think, and this is different for everybody, but like an article to me is usually something very deep on a technical issue, and you're trying to kind of add to this body of understanding about this technical issue. And for me, at least, a book is kind of like trying to kind of understand a bigger picture. And so in ways, to me, it seemed natural to kind of do all this technical stuff and say, all right, what's the big picture? And I know enough of the technical stuff that, I would have a good sense of if I'm telling the right story about the big picture.
Yeah. And now you can give all the details because you're not limited to like 30 or 40 pages.
Right. That's right. Although, but, you're thinking about, like for one of my articles, my audience are, people like me, people who know a lot about housing finance. But for a book, I want to, originally I wanted to write it for my mom. That's definitely a fail. But I would want to write it for, somebody who's interested in housing policy or housing finance or urban policy. I want it to be broadly accessible to people interested in this broad topic.
Yeah. And we missed talking about the Rent Guidelines Board a little bit, so I wanted to just quickly tie in. I know there's not a lot to talk about, but you were appointed in 2019 by de Blasio, right? Mayor de Blasio. And how did that come about? What were your functions and what was your experience on that board?
The mayor's office asked me to serve first as a public member. I can't remember what year that was. That might have been 2019. And then I served as a public member for a couple of years, and then for 3 years as the chair. The Rent Guidelines Board, all the New York City listeners are going to be somewhat familiar with it, but beyond New York City, this is the board that sets rent adjustments for 1 million rent-stabilized units in New York City. More than 2 million people live in it. It's an incredibly important resource for the city. And the job of the board is to balance the interests of the owners of the real estate and the people who live in it. And really, I always thought of our function as our client is the housing stock itself. So to ensure that the housing stock is funded sufficiently to be maintained and do capital repairs as necessary. But it's obviously a really hot potato issue because rents go up, and that's difficult for lots of tenants in New York City. But then owners also need to pay the bills, and some of those bills are driven by the city itself. Property taxes. Some of those bills are driven by third parties like insurance companies, and trying to kind of take in all that information about the housing stock and then try to come up with this one number that's supposed to address it overall is a real challenge. It's the kind of thing that when you read a newspaper article about it, you could be like, oh, what's the big deal? But like, it actually takes an immense amount of effort to kind of think, to put your best work into it. And it made me so much more sympathetic for people in more important positions, like, the chair of the Federal Reserve. Like, what should the interest rate be? Like, that's a really hard thing to figure out. And everyone's, what does he know? He made a mistake again. And you're like, that's really hard to do that. So my sympathy for somebody like that has only increased. So
yeah, I think what the Rent Stabilization Board does, it determines the increases for 1 or 2 year leases for rent stabilized tenants, and it's a very difficult thing because you're affecting both sides of the table, the rent stabilized tenants and the landlords. So how many people comprise the board? And then there are certain reports that are prepared. Obviously, there are staff members or employees of the board that work for the board, I guess, and prepare these reports so that exactly either how to vote, or do they come up with a suggestion? How does that work?
So it's very obscure, but those are good questions. But it's a very thinly staffed agency. So there's like 4 employees, 3 of whom are on the research staff, and the board is composed of 9 members, a chair who serves at the pleasure of the mayor, and then 2 who are really there as advocates for tenants, and 2 who are there advocates for owners, and then 4 other public members who, with the chair, are there to kind of represent the interests of the public broadly, kind of in between those 2 extremes. And the staff produces a series of reports over the kind of the first part of the year about all of the expenses that are happening in terms of housing, in terms of operating costs, in terms of finance costs, and then also a study on what's happening with New York City tenants in terms of employment rates and inflation, and then the 9 members of the board discuss these reports. They discuss different approaches. The staff makes not necessarily recommendations, but provides some kind of metrics that the board can consider. But then the buck stops with the board, and they have to. If 5 people agree as to what that number is, then that will be the number.
And it's an interesting time when you joined, right? 2019, when the new rent laws were passed, the new protections for tenants, particularly for rent-stabilized tenants, and also COVID was right around the corner. Was there anything interesting that happened during that time period in 2020, 2021, where there were lots of evictions, people who weren't going to work, people who were laid off, people who were sick and dying? Was there anything that changed in that process during that time, or did it just go on the way it always does?
Well, so first of all, it went completely virtual, and that was, as many arms of the government did, and the staff pulled that off really well, and that was great. The big problem that it presents is that most of the data, almost all the data that the board deals with is data looking backwards. Very little, although some, is looking forwards, kind of expected increase in inflation. And so generally looking backwards when things are kind of operating roughly smoothly is fine. But when there's dramatic changes like COVID or inflation, skyrockets, then you don't know how to deal with the data, and it makes it much more difficult, and it feels much more fraught to make a decision when you have reason to believe the data is not telling you the same kinds of stories it told you in the past.
Yeah, because you don't have all the information.
Yeah. But and then also the government, the federal government, and the states, implemented all sorts of policies and financial actions that changed things up, and the federal government poured money into the pockets of tons of Americans, and that had some impacts as well. And so, it was just really complicated, and the staff tried to kind of take that all into account in terms of prepping the board for making their decisions.
Yeah.
But it was very hard.
I think it's a very difficult position to be in, particularly during that time. And as you know, there's a form of good cause eviction that also passed, which I call universal rent stabilization. It's not really good cause eviction from my perspective. Do you have any thoughts about that at all?
Well, it was the basis of my property exam. So
oh, really?
Yeah. And because the Supreme Court took up last year, there was some cert petitions about whether the rent stabilization regime was amounted to a takings under the Fifth Amendment. Struggling with that, and the takings clause is this struggle between the majoritarian tendencies of the legislature to represent the will of the people more broadly, and then the Constitution, which protects the interests of property owners through the takings clause, and so it's a very thorny, constitutional question, but then there's also, people have very strong feelings about it just as a policy matter as well. And so it's been interesting reading the students' exams because, I would say as all a bunch of people in their 20s to a very large extent, they're very sympathetic to tenants, seeing themselves in those shoes. Yeah. And then some of them are also kind of cognizant of the arguments of economists that says that in the long run, limitations on rent are going to suppress the supply of housing and will have impacts on people as well. But they were struggling on these issues from a constitutional perspective and then also from a policy perspective.
Everybody's struggling with these issues. I would hope that 23-year-olds would be struggling with them. Yeah. But the 2019 rent laws, the changes to the rent laws, that was actually argued, I believe, that it was Right,
and yes, that's the Pinehurst case and the Chip case, but the Supreme Court passed on those cases. They denied the cert petitions, but Justice Thomas had a statement in this past February where he said, well, if owners made a certain set of arguments, I think they would have another bite at the apple. And it's unclear what that means because nobody else signed off on this statement with Justice Thomas, but this is still a live issue. And this is a pretty conservative, pretty pro-property rights court, so we don't know what they'll do.
Yeah, I think it's a tough authority issue, and we're not going to resolve it here, but it's definitely more things to come in the future. Right now,
Yeah.
I think it's settled for this semester. For this semester for now. Is there anything that that we should have talked about, or that I should have asked you that I didn't?
You know, I don't know. We've been talking a lot about law students, and I'm just thinking about like people who are starting out in their careers, and you know, some of the advice that I give them, and I think we're all lawyers here, but even if you're on the business side, just really the importance of like, you know, listening to things like Shaping the New York City Skyline, and you know, throwing yourself into the business of whatever you're interested in, and having exposure and learning how to kind of talk the talk with people who are more senior than you in the field. It's almost always an excellent use of your time, and I tell my students that all the time. So
yeah, and I want to echo that, and that's one of the reasons, you know, we have lots of reasons to do this podcast, but doing what you're doing as a professor, although I'm not a professor, is trying to explain things to people simply, but not from me, from the people that we bring on and their perspective, so they can explain, you know, the different facets and different areas that they're practicing and working on. And to me, that's I think we have some law students, maybe a lot of law students that are listening, and I completely echo that. Reading, listening, understanding the jargon, going to people who speak talk the talk, so that you understand these things, and then, you know, look them up, Google them. It's so easy. Google the terms, understand what they are, and you'll definitely go much farther and farther in your career.
yeah, agreed.
Anything you want? I knew you want to plug the book, but is there anything else that you can plug, or if you want people to reach out to you, where they can find you?
Well, I'm a big fan of the podcast Shaping the New York City Skyline. I've been listening to it at the gym recently, and so
That's great. You got time for the gym.
And we didn't have to plug the podcast today. He did it twice.
We like to say the name of the podcast in the name of it. You did it for us. So.
I know that because I listen to the podcast and I hear that as a constant theme. So, but no, that's about it. Just Shaping the New York City Skyline. I guess I would say this. I think in your Douglaston podcast, your most recent one, just this notion of like, there's certain kinds of people who want to be in real estate, and it's people who get excited about how, you know, like you might have had the smallest role. I might have worked on the title issues or the survey issues for, you know, a big building in Manhattan, but like, you know, you're excited to be part of that thing. And you know, the people who know, and, you know, people who think of themselves as dirt lawyers know why they're dirt lawyers. And for students out there, dirt lawyers are real estate lawyers because, you know, dealing with something concrete and tangible gives you professional pleasure, and that's a great thing. And so people who like that kind of stuff know it.
No, I fully agree, and you're in a good company because that's exactly who we are. We're dirt lawyers. We love that term. We love our Skyliners. And David Reiss, thank you so much, Professor David Reiss. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm so thankful to you for giving the basis of what turned out to be a real estate career that I didn't know that I was going to have.
David, thank you, and Camilla, thank you.
Thanks for
It's been
coming.
a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and bslakowski at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.